Detroit's tax base, the total property tax base that is taxable, has declined by about 80%, while its tax rates have doubled. So you can see, from that dilemma, it is really important to stabilize revenues, but it's also a question of, can you do that by continuing to tax property at the aggressive rate that Detroit does?
That's the voice of Nick Allen. On Your Daily Detroit, a deep dive into a single topic for this Wednesday, May 11th, 2022. I'm Chair Stays, and thanks for joining us. Longtime listeners might remember the words split property taxes. The idea being, the city of Detroit's tax burden is only second to New York City. But I don't know if you've looked around. We don't have the household incomes, the commerce, or the number of people to support that. So the idea is to change the code to make it so land speculators and others would get punished, and those who are taking care of and improving their land get rewarded. Now that the city of Detroit has a better handle of its finances and we're not immediately after bankruptcy, maybe it's time for city leaders to look to the future. What could we do differently to truly become more resident-friendly and more competitive for businesses of all sizes? What if Detroit could change the system so there were fewer foreclosures and more people stay in their homes? When we talked about this last, it was more theoretical. Now, there's a new report by the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy that was commissioned by some local big hitters in Invest Detroit and the Kresge Foundation. That, if you're paying attention, is major local interest in the topic. So let's dive into this conversation. Joining me virtually, Nick Allen. He's a PhD candidate at MIT and formerly worked in Detroit as a revitalization fellow, placed at the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation for a couple years, working on a variety of tasks. So I think he's somebody, not only because he's involved in this report we're going to talk about, but because he spent some time here in Detroit, that I think can give us kind of an overview and understanding where we're at with this very interesting topic to me, which is split rate property taxes. So, Nick, welcome to Daily Detroit.
Thanks, Jared. Great to be back virtually in the city.
We mentioned this on the show about a year ago. It got some traction, but I don't want to assume that everyone knows what we're talking about here. At its core, what exactly is a split rate property tax?
Yeah, so the split rate, or let's call it a split property tax, because I think that actually clarifies what we're talking about here. It's a really simple change to what everybody understands a property tax is. The property tax taxes all property. And in this version of a property tax, all you're doing is saying, actually, let's tax some of the most important parts of property less, like improvements in particular. And in exchange, let's tax land more. There are a lot of reasons that we would like to tax land more. But in general, the idea here is for every dollar you tax improvements less, so improvements meaning structures, even pavement, and the physical investments in property, you can offset that reduced dollar with an added dollar on taxes on land.
And in the city of Detroit, which is, and we have talked about this a number of times on the show, has one of the highest tax burdens in the nation, this could have a material impact on a lot of things, right?
Yeah, and that's actually been true, Jared, since the 1970s. If you go back and look at the Census of Local Governments reports from the U.S. federal government, you'll see that the Detroit has really been far out ahead in terms of the effective rates, particularly on residents, but also on small businesses, on big industry, on just about every class of owners.
Is that something that has been hurting growth?
I certainly think so. And I think the best testament to that is really two things. One is about the challenges with stability, abandonment, and foreclosure in neighborhoods. And the other thing that I think is really important to think about is tax abatements, that almost every investment that the city contemplates needs some kind of tax relief to get off the ground.
So why did Detroit get such a high tax rate? I think in Metro Detroit, our scale, especially because you got a lot of people, maybe they haven't lived in other cities. What happened to get us here? Because I think, you cross the border into the suburbs, and even it's mind blowing to people that your tax rate as far as property tax may be lower, even say in the Grosse Pointes or in a rich neighborhood.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think it's Detroiters know the history of this better than I certainly do. But the way that I think about it is that in a period of challenges and additional kind of competitive threats from the suburbs, and then the flight, and particularly white flight that resulted from that, and capital flight that resulted from that, it became increasingly difficult for the city and other local governments to sustain the services that they were offering, right? The only way that they could do that was either to issue more bonded debt or to raise tax rates. And at some point, you raise tax rates to a point where it starts to tip people towards additional flight. You just continue to narrow and narrow the base and concentrate more and more taxes on people who choose to stay in the city or who don't have a choice to leave. And I think, that dynamic has really persisted for almost 60 years now. Detroit's tax base, the total property tax base that is taxable, has declined by about 80%, while its tax rates have doubled. So you can see, from that dilemma, it is really important to stabilize revenues, but it's also a question of, can you do that by continuing to tax property at the aggressive rate that Detroit does?
This also has impact with, say, the foreclosure crisis, because a number of people, and I don't have the number in front of me, but a stunning number of people have lost their homes in recent years. And a big part of that is, they're behind on their taxes.
Yeah, I think that was a big entry point to this conversation for me. It felt like, we had some ideas about how this could be solved for economic development, or at least in a limited sense, with tax abatements. But what I was really thinking about is not only has there been a foreclosure crisis for the last decade, but there have been people making sort of forced choices about abandonment for years in the city. And a lot of that has to do with excess costs on property, that it just becomes unsustainable, whether it's because you're getting the rents you are or because you just cannot afford the mortgage on top of the taxes. It is a more sensible decision not to continue to pay your taxes or to simply leave the property behind. And I think that's an incredibly unjust and unfair choice for Detroiters to have to make.
Well, and it's not just for abandonment, but people who decide that, hey, I can't raise a family here. I need that money back in my pocket for a lower rate in the suburbs, or lower rate or perceive better services in the suburbs. That's something that I have seen, I'm in my 40s now. For the last 20 years, I haven't seen that pattern break of, okay, well, now I'm married and have a kid, bye, and I just haven't seen that pattern break.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Jared. And I don't mean to say abandonment is the only thing going on there for sure. I think you're right that it's really, if people are making those choices about where to live, you really want them to be thinking about what are the best services that I need at this point in my life, and not thinking about what are the costs that I must avoid to maintain everything else that I need to do for my family.
Let's talk about the journey of split property taxes in Detroit, because this is an idea that is, kind of percolated a little bit up. Where did this all kind of come from?
I can give you two different origin stories here. One that I knew about when I started this, which was that in actually just around the time of the bankruptcy, when Ken Cockrell Jr. was serving as interim mayor, he approached several academics actually to ask about what are alternatives for restructuring revenue. Right, we're doing a huge amount during bankruptcy to restructure expenditures for the city, and the city suffered a lot of pain through that expenditure revision. But there was not a lot of conversation around thinking deeply about, where should we be collecting revenue from? And so Ken approached a couple of people, Mark Skidmore at MSU, Gary Sands at Wayne State, and a couple of other people who have thought about this for a long time to ask that question. One of the ideas they raised was a split tax. So that's origin story one. The other thing that I was really interested to learn, though, was I've read a lot into the archives about this, looking at the history of how the city has viewed taxes and the dilemmas that it has. And I learned that in Coleman Young's 1973 campaign, so his first campaign for mayor, one of his platforms was that Detroiters are paying far too much in taxes. And the really weird thing about that is we are essentially incentivizing speculation because we don't tax because land values are very low, while punishing investment. He hit that point again and again in the campaign trail. It was really part of his stump speech. And we didn't get very far in that legislatively at the time. But I actually think Coleman Young was exactly right, even as early as 1973.
So let's talk about the practical impact of this. And one of the things that caught my eye with this round, to talk about it again, is this new report that was commissioned in part, I believe, by Invest Detroit and the Kresge Foundation. And when I see those two kind of names tied to something, that's when I'm start to say, hey, wait a minute. Like this has more local traction, whereas about a year ago, we didn't really have those same names publicly attached to these things. What's kind of changed, and what does this report kind of tell us?
So I actually think that the city, Invest Detroit, and the Kresge Foundation really went at this exactly the right way, which was they said, okay, so this seems conceptually like a very good idea, but what do we actually find when we look at the historical case studies here and when we think about the effects that we expect to see in Detroit? So we did these kind of major empirical papers and then a forecasting study looking at what does this actually mean in terms of fiscal consequences for the city. And I'd say very loosely, we can talk about any of these areas, but the big questions were, what does this mean for business investment, and particularly small businesses and job-intensive industries? What does it mean for property values and really every type of property? And finally, what does it mean when you reduce taxes on residents? What changes? Are they better able to afford their taxes? Are there reduced rates of tax foreclosure? And so we looked at the 17 cities in Pennsylvania that have implemented split rate taxes since the 1970s. And we also looked at Detroit's actual experiences with tax reductions in the past.
So what are some of the things that you found?
Surprisingly good news on every front. I think there's a lot of understanding of how a higher tax on land really sort of reduces the profits of speculation, and a lower tax on untaxing improvements rewards investment. But we were surprised to see that these effects really sort of are very visible in all of these different cases. So with respect to commercial and residential property, we found this 10 to 20% increase in market values just simply by changing the weights on land and building taxes. On the small business side, what we found, and I guess business in general, we found a real shift towards capital-intensive industry. That industries that require more investment are able to move into the city, and those are typically industries that also have a higher jobs concentration. So, of course, manufacturing, construction, and actually retail in this case were the big things we noticed. And we also noticed a sizable increase in jobs overall. These are smaller cities that we looked at in Pennsylvania. So, conservatively, we found, I think, about 70 net new businesses just after implementing. Detroit is 10 times bigger, so we don't know how much bigger than 70 we would expect. Oh, and then the last thing I would just say is on the residential side which I think was the real kind of leading point on this question about what does it do to reduce the overburden on residents? And to recognize, of course, that people have been paying these structurally high tax rates and then making really hard choices against those rates, as we discussed. And I think the happy news was that we found exactly what we would expect, is, of course, that property values go higher just because if you reduce taxes, there's more property value available. Your costs are less in the future. But the other part of that is we saw a significant reduction in tax foreclosures. And the way we looked at that is we asked, the reassessment that happened in 2014 to 2017 substantially reduced taxes for many, many residents in the city. And we just looked at what happened when that occurred. And what we found was that if you were to reduce taxes again by, say, 20%, you could bring down the foreclosure rate by another 10%,
Wow.
Which is, a pretty strong effect as we saw compared when you think about other interventions that are available. They're often much later stage, right? They're trying to help people recover from delinquency. And in this case, we're basically able to solve the solution for people permanently by just reducing the tax burden.
One of the reasons why you have the situations that you do in the city when you drive down some streets and you see issues is because it's really difficult to get access to capital to fix up those houses.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I think, repair loans are part of that, but it's also, there's a disincentive when new improvements are taxed really heavily, and especially when you don't know how they're going to be assessed. So I think you're right. Making sure that people are not paying too much more for those additional improvements really matters to helping people make those decisions.
Let's talk about the economic development side. So one of the things I noticed, and this is only because, I'm from the east side, you have large tracts of land that are held by one person or a couple of groups, and they seemingly being able to sit on them forever. And it seems to be very little incentive to develop them and then use them as playing cards when a major development wants to happen to cash out. But I'll go through a place and nothing will happen for 5 or 7 years, and that land will just sit there. Or you could look at downtown Detroit and look at all the number of surface parking lots we have where you've got, people who have using the least possible use for a piece of land where it sits empty most of the time and just holds cars instead of a building, residents, businesses, all that kind of stuff. How would that impact this?
Sure. Yeah. It's interesting. I spent a lot of time working on industrial development and identifying sites in the city that would, where it was possible to, say, develop a new multifamily property. And it is incredibly difficult when people can essentially reserve land as long as they need to because the carrying costs are very low. I think the way this works is essentially the problem in the city right now is any type of investment, whether you're talking about these small repairs for housing or large scale investment on the scale of a new plant, is incredibly expensive, but holding land is incredibly cheap. And of course, land is cheap because investment is expensive. So there's a nice little circular function there. And so the way I think about that, right, is if you're thinking about how do I scratch out a profit in the city, or how do I scratch out a very sizable profit in the city, you can do very well by amassing a huge portfolio of land and carrying that land at a very low cost. So I think all we're trying to do is saying, actually that carry cost should be higher. You should be encouraged to either invest in your property or to sell to somebody who is ready to invest in that property. Now, of course, there are a lot of different people holding land in a lot of different ways in the city. So we should also talk about that. But I think especially for those large portfolios, your intuition is exactly right.
Let's get into those then, since we're here. There are a lot of different ways. I could see different scenarios where people might not like the situation. For instance, what about somebody who, say, has a secondary plot next to their house and they're doing like a little urban garden, right? Would this hurt them?
That's a great question. And we actually looked at this really carefully, and this is something the city is very attentive to as well. So the way I think about this, especially with the side lot program, which is the program where you can buy the vacant lot next to your property and maintain it and keep it up. The way that works is that the primary owner owns one parcel and one house. 5% of the value that they own is the parcel, 95% of the value is the house. If you buy the lot next door, now it's 90% of the value of the house is the house and 10% of value is the parcel. So what you're getting is essentially a significant tax reduction on the house, the vast majority of what you own, and a small increase on the land. So when we looked at every single side lot owner in the city, it was basically impossible to identify an owner who didn't still see a tax reduction.
Oh, wow.
I kind of buried the lead here. One of the things we found in the study is that 96% of Detroiters who own residential property, homeowners and landlords included, see a reduction in their tax burden.
Well, and I feel like with a city that is having trouble keeping its population, residences need to be the priority.
Agreed, 100%.
Speaking of residences, what about, and this is a bit of a wildcat question, I don't know if you looked into this, but there is a real challenge if you, say, want to buy a lot and build a single family home right now. I know of one person who's done it, and they had a huge amount of trouble trying to handle all the rigmarole and pieces and making that stuff happen. The city of Detroit, I've had a number of listeners come to me, and I've, kind of dealt with it myself of, there are a number of plots of land near the studio here that you could pick up for 20 grand, 25 grand, whatever. But building a house on it, not only would it make things, more expensive for you, but it would be in the cost range of, $400,000 to $500,000. And that doesn't seem like very practical from a trying to repopulate the city point of view.
Yeah. And I will say this, I think construction costs and new development, there are a lot of challenges there, but particularly around material costs and labor costs for building new. So we can't solve all of that, right? But what we can do is make it relatively easier for people who are looking at those options, right? If you can make the acquisition cost of land cheaper and the carrying cost of housing cheaper, you're doing a great deal to just unlock a few more sites where housing development might be possible. This isn't going to change everywhere in the city overnight, and it really shouldn't, right? I don't think we want that kind of change, and I think Detroiters rightfully have some concern about significant changes in their neighborhood. But what it does do is it makes some investments make sense, and it doesn't require the same rigmarole of pursuing a tax abatement for a small project like that.
Oh, I mean, and the reason why I ask about the single family house is that's something that's been an issue in my neighborhood, where there are some groups who say they don't want the big multifamily thing. Why can't we get some single family construction to blend in with the neighborhood that we have? I don't know if I share that opinion, but I'm just expressing that because that's something that I have heard from my neighbors.
Yeah. And here's the way I think about it is in two things. One is the economics of single family construction are actually really hard compared to multifamily. But the other part of that is, what we're trying to do here is actually maintain the existing stock of single family homes in the city. That is the cheapest way to guarantee single family properties around. And to do that, you have to reduce the cost structure on those properties.
As far as the manufacturing and commercial side, this is interesting to me that it would favor these kind of high intensive industries, because it reminds me of a term that I heard many years ago, jobs Detroiters can do, jobs that, a lot of Detroit does not have a high educational attainment right now. That's just the fact. So jobs like working at auto suppliers or light industrial are jobs that, that's what it is. Jobs that Detroiters can do, jobs that are accessible. How much does it impact that? And how much does it hurt the other side? How much would this, say, hurt an office company or a company like a Quicken? Is there an offset there, or is it kind of neutral to one and benefits the other?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, both those type of industries need a lot of real estate, right? And in particular, so an industrial facility needs a lot of capital improvements that are mostly, it's primarily the building, but it's also the equipment. And then a real estate building tends like a Quicken tends to have a very improved property, often in a central location where you can attract a lot of workers. So in both those cases, what we see is that the tax burdens on those types of real estate go down. And it doesn't, we can talk about very large, heavy manufacturing in the facilities. They still see a reduction in their tax burden. The same is true of high-rise office buildings in the city. It's basically a stimulus. I guess the way I think about it is no matter what type of job you're talking about, having more real estate and capital intensiveness is complementary to having more jobs. Those two things go together really well. And a city that can sustain more capital investment is also a city that can sustain a bigger job space.
So as you understand it, where are we with all this? Listeners, this is a lot of information, but I think there's going to be people who go, okay, where are we? Where are we in the process? How is it as you understand it?
I think there's a lot of interest, and I really I credit everybody who worked on this report in figuring that out. The Lincoln Institute of Land Policy here in Cambridge was really instrumental in that, and there were a number of economists both in Michigan and outside of Michigan, including several deputy state treasurers who really looked at this carefully and I think rigorously and didn't assume that this was the right solution. They just wanted to know what effect would it have. So I think there's a couple things to do. The first is that if this were to be a policy option, it's really important that people understand the implications for themselves, right? I think people understand what property taxes mean for them, but it's really important to lay out what the alternative looks like. And the other thing that's actually needed is legislative passage in Lansing. To allow a local government to do this would require some change in legislation. So to split the property tax between a higher tax on land and a lower tax on buildings would require the legislature to allow cities to do so. I guess our view has always been that should be an opt-in basis. You don't want to compel every city in Michigan to do this, although we do think this would be really good for just about any city that implemented it.
Yeah, because I think about some of the entering suburbs that are also facing some struggles right now.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think this is a really common thing that happens is the service costs and particularly legacy costs like debt make it really difficult to continue to compete with suburbs that are able to do greenfield development. And so being able to basically take a less depletable tax source that is less, where there is less overburden on residents makes those inner ring suburbs also more attractive.
Well, and Detroit City Council is looking at some of this too. They're doing some research around it. You sent me a note that actually our podcast was part of the notes for some of the research that they were doing.
Yeah, I was excited to see that. And I was excited to see City Council take an interest.
Yeah. So that would be something that the next step then would have to happen in the state legislature. And so that's something that I feel like I should be asking about at the Mackinac Policy Conference later this month.
I would love it if you did.
I got to say, thank you so much, Nick Allen. I appreciate you for all of this. And I appreciate you getting into the weeds on this. This is something where I think this could make a huge deal and make a huge change in the city of Detroit in a very practical way that'll impact a lot of residents and a lot of people who want to do things here in the city. So I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Jared. It was really a pleasure to work on this. I've really loved working in the city, and I just really appreciate you taking the time to think through this.
All right, thanks for listening. Before I let you go, if you found this valuable or interesting, consider supporting the show at buymeacoffee.com/dailydetroit. A few bucks goes a long way in being able to do this kind of all local content that can really impact our community. With that, I'm Jer Stays. Remember that you are somebody, and we'll talk tomorrow.